On Maryland's eastern shore, a couple's romantic weekend getaway turns lethal when a man dies in a deadly blaze. Though all of the evidence suggests a tragic accident, a routine investigation exposes some troubling irregularities. In Florida, an apparently healthy woman dies in her home, and examiners can find nothing to explain the death. Though police suspect murder, years will pass before new forensic technology offers any hope of proving it. When an untraceable poison is used to commit murder, homicide detectives face a difficult challenge. For help, they turn to forensic toxicologists to follow a killer's tracks and expose a toxic death. St. Michael's is an historic fishing village turned resort on Maryland's eastern shore. Quaint, tree-lined streets and old homes and boutiques have made it a popular weekend getaway.
Talbot County 911.
In the early morning hours of February 15th, 1998, an emergency dispatcher received a frantic call from a clerk at a local resort.
Is there anybody in the room?
One of the rooms was on fire, and he believed a guest was trapped inside.
East and I-36, respond to St. Michael's Resort. Fire. At least one subject in the room.
Within minutes, rescue workers from the Talbot County Fire Department and officers from the Maryland State Police arrived at the location. The blaze, confined to a single room, was quickly brought under control. Though the hotel clerks had managed to pull the guest from the room, the victim, 35-year-old Stephen Rico, was pronounced dead at the scene. His face had been burned beyond recognition. Police learned that shortly before 1:30 a.m., the victim's wife rushed into the hotel lobby to report that her room was on fire. The clerks called 911 and then rushed to the room. They found the victim lying in bed and quickly pulled him out. But it was too late. The victim's wife, 33-year-old Kim Rico, said she and her husband Steve were spending Valentine's weekend together.
A little bit and give me a little bit here.
Earlier that evening, she and Steve had dinner with friends at the hotel's dinner theater.
Make sure your wife is okay. Have a little
Kim said Steve had been drinking heavily and had taken antidepressants and cold medication.
Oh, well, why don't we have a toast to you, honey?
Kim said that Steve became sloppy drunk.
Cheers, Mom.
It's so bad.
She and her husband returned to their room a few hours later. Steve continued to drink. Then he began pressuring her for sex.
You're drunk, and I'm not interested. No, I'm not interested.
When Kim refused, he became angry.
Hey, no, I'm not.
To avoid a fight, she grabbed her things and left to go for a drive. When she returned a few hours later, she made her way into the room and was immediately overcome by smoke. She couldn't believe her husband of 10 years was gone.
He's a smoker? What kind of cigars does he smoke?
Investigators searched for answers to explain the deadly blaze. Maryland Deputy State Fire Marshal Mike Mulligan began by looking for the fire's origin.
The point of origin is key in determining the cause of a fire and determining whether it was accidental or purposely set. And what you do is you begin at the area of least fire damage and you progress into the most fire damage. And the idea is that at the spot where you have the most fire damage, the fire has been burning the longest.
On the nightstand next to the bed, investigators found their first clue: a partially melted soft drink bottle.
The heat softened the plastic on the side that faced the fire while it was still cold on the other side, and the plastic began to melt and pointed the neck of the bottle toward the point of origin.
The fire had apparently started near the pillow, where Stephen Rico's head would have been. Burn patterns showed its progress across the bed and down to the charred carpet. Then, investigators uncovered a possible cause of the fire. On the bedside table, they found an open package of cigars. One was missing. For fire marshals, the reason behind the blaze seemed tragically clear.
We could eliminate the electrical, we could eliminate the heating and the air conditioning units, we could eliminate the wood-burning stove, and what did that leave us with? Well, one of the possibilities was careless smoking.
At autopsy, the medical examiner found that Stephen Rico had suffered severe burns to his head, arms, and torso. But surprisingly, no traces of soot or carbon monoxide were found in the victim's lungs. That suggested he had stopped breathing before the room had filled with smoke. Having found no cause of death, blood and tissue samples were collected for further analysis. Toxicologists at the Maryland State Police Crime Lab confirmed that there was no carbon monoxide present in the victim's blood or tissue. And blood alcohol test results were 0.00%. Examiners found no evidence suggesting that Steve had been drinking or taking pills, as his wife claimed. The results were passed on to the Maryland State Police. Homicide Detective Joe Gamble struggled to reconcile all the facts of the case.
They could not determine how he died. They could tell us that he didn't die of any natural causes. There was no alcohol in Stephen's blood, no soot or carbon monoxide in his lungs. That did not jive with what Kimberly Rico told us that night.
To resolve the inconsistencies, detectives questioned the victim's wife again. Kim Rico was surprised by the lab findings. In addition to drinking heavily at dinner, Steve had purchased beer and cigars earlier that day. She admitted her marriage had been rocky, but claimed she and Steve had managed to work out their problems. Everything had been going so well.
Does he know about it?
As the questioning continued, Kim grew nervous. Then she asked for an attorney and ended the interview. To find out what Kim Rico was hiding, police contacted the couple's friends. All agreed that Kim and Steve had been working hard to salvage their marriage. But none of the friends had ever known Steve to smoke cigars. The inconsistent information, in addition to the autopsy findings, led investigators to suspect that Steve Rico's death had not resulted from an accident, as his wife suggested.
No evidence of alcohol was found in his blood.
To prove it, they would first need to determine exactly how the fire started. They turned to arson investigators at the Maryland State Fire Marshal's office. At a training facility in eastern Maryland, fire marshals looked to recreate the damage observed at the scene. They lit the same brand of cigar found inside the room and placed it on a pillow they'd obtained from the hotel. It smoldered, then went out. The ash from the lit cigar failed to ignite the flame-retardant pillow.
We took the cigars and placed them on the pillows. Did this repeatedly for approximately an hour and a half. And what the test showed us was that careless smoking could not have been the cause of ignition caused by the pillow.
Though investigators now suspected an accelerant had been used to start the blaze, lab tests failed to expose any traces of a flammable substance.
Hot, quick, or hard to get going.
However, the accelerant might have burned away during the fire. The only other way investigators could ignite the pillow and recreate the burn damage was by applying a makeshift torch directly to it.
The tests confirmed that the fire was incendiary in nature, that it was not an accidental fire. It was not a cause of careless smoking.
The fire had been intentionally set. The findings were passed on to police. Soon after, Stephen Rico's death was officially classified as a homicide. Authorities on Maryland's eastern shore proved that a hotel room fire that claimed the life of 35-year-old Steve Rico was not the result of careless smoking, as his wife Kim suggested. Having found no traces of smoke in the victim's lungs, it was also clear that Steve Rico was already dead when the fire was set. But the medical examiner was unable to determine exactly how he died. All of the findings led police to believe that Kim Rico had murdered her husband. Now they looked for physical evidence to prove it. Police tracked down her co-workers at a Washington, D.C. hospital, where she was employed as a surgical technician.
Did she ever bring up her husband?
No one believed Kim was capable of murder.
Yeah, she did a couple of times, as a matter of fact.
However, one doctor did recall an unusual conversation he had with her a month earlier.
I've been meaning to talk to you about that.
Kim had been complaining about her marriage and jokingly offered him $50,000 to kill her husband.
What are you talking about?
Not taking her seriously, he joked back, telling her she could put Stephen to sleep forever by injecting him with a drug called succinylcholine.
Now, what would that do to somebody?
Kim's co-worker described the drug as a powerful muscle relaxant used to prevent involuntary movement during surgery.
1900.
As a surgical technician, Kim used it nearly every day. Homicide detective Joe Gamble.
Kimberly Rico's profession was significant working as a surgical technician, in that she had access to certain drugs that other people in the hospital and that normal citizens don't have access to. One of those drugs, we learned, was succinylcholine.
Though toxicology tests turned up no traces of the drug in Stephen Rico's body, detectives learned that succinylcholine breaks down almost immediately, leaving no detectable traces behind. In essence, the drug is a perfect murder weapon.
It's injected into the tissue, doesn't have to go into the bloodstream, and it causes your muscles to relax, which includes your heart and your diaphragm and your breathing. And with enough succinylcholine, you just stop breathing and your heart stops and you die.
With the homicide investigation taking on a clearer focus, detectives returned to the crime scene. While they searched the hotel for a syringe or a drug vial, divers combed the Miles River, located directly behind the resort. They spent hours combing the bottom of the river and the surrounding area. But their search turned up nothing. A few days later, however, a hotel employee found something lying in the grass. It was a discarded syringe. The evidence was forwarded to the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. A thorough analysis of the needle failed to produce any traces of the victim's blood or succinylcholine. Examiners applied a laser light to the evidence, hoping to find fingerprints that may have been left behind. But all of their efforts turned up nothing. With no obvious motive or a murder weapon, investigators would have to rely on the circumstantial evidence to prove that Kim Rico had killed her husband. And their best hope was to establish that she had staged the crime scene to throw investigators off her trail.
So we set out, of course, to find out where the alcohol came from and where the cigars came from, hopefully proving that Kimberly bought these things or purchased these things to stage the room, to set the room up.
What if I could take a couple minutes of your time? Check and see if a
Detective Gamble canvassed convenience stores near the resort.
Cigars recently.
He found a clerk who recalled a woman matching Kim Rico's description. The store employee told him that around the time of the murder, the woman came in to purchase a six-pack of beer and a pack of cigars. The customer had made a lasting impression on the clerk.
Who dyes your hair?
The store clerk remembered Kimberly that day because Kimberly was particularly rude.
Thank you.
Kimberly had been so abrupt with her, and that stood out in the store clerk's mind. That's how she was able to remember her.
Police collected a package of cigars like the ones purchased by Kim Rico.
Price tag on that.
They were the same brand found in the Rico's hotel room. Investigators also collected the stamp gun used to attach the price stickers to the merchandise.
Mark everything in the store with? Thanks for your time.
The items were delivered to forensic document examiner Joan DiMartino at the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. To establish a link between the evidence, she began comparing the characteristics of the price sticker on the cigar pack found at the crime scene to the one collected from the convenience store.
The characteristic of most significance would be the design cuts, the tamper-proof die cuts that cause something to break away if say, a ne'er-do-well person wanted to peel off the price tag, it would break away. These are common to a particular manufacturer.
A visual inspection revealed no differences between all of the stickers collected. Using an infrared light source, DiMartino looked for commonalities and differences within the ink itself. She found that the dyes and pigments that make each ink unique were the same on both cigar packs. They had all originated from the same stamp gun collected from the convenience store. Kim Rico had purchased the cigars found at the crime scene, something she had previously denied. Police were building a strong circumstantial case against Kim Rico. But having revealed no official cause of death and no obvious motive behind the homicide, investigators were still a long way from proving murder. Maryland police were convinced that 33-year-old surgical technician Kim Rico had murdered her husband with an untraceable drug, then staged the scene to make his death appear as a tragic accident. But so far, all of the evidence amassed against her was circumstantial. Looking to uncover a motive, police re-interviewed people close to the couple.
Talk to you about Kimberly. I understand that you're friends with her?
One friend admitted that just before Stephen's death, Kim said that she wanted to divorce him.
Have you known her?
Kim had been having an affair with a man she'd met a few months before. They'd been spending a lot of time together. And Kim was no longer interested in salvaging her marriage to Steve. But Kim was dreading a prolonged and costly divorce.
Thank you very much for your time.
The information was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant to search Kim's home. There, in a desk drawer, they found 2 life insurance policies, taken out on Stephen Rico. Kim stood to gain $200,000 from her husband's death. It was the break homicide detectives had been looking for.
We felt that Kimberly had motive. She had a large amount of money to gain. She had been involved in an affair that she wanted to move forward with. And those were the 2 things that we felt that Kimberly wanted to gain by the murder of Stephen Rico. We got out of Kim Rico's house on Bellamy Drive.
A warrant was issued for Kim Rico's arrest. But before police could act, they received some startling information.
Where's she at?
Kim Rico had attempted
How
suicide.
long ago was that? Okay.
One of Kim's friends had become concerned when she hadn't heard from her in some time. When she went to check on her, she found Kim unconscious on the floor. An empty bottle of pills lay nearby. Kim Rico, the prime suspect in her husband's death, was rushed to a nearby hospital. Though she was in critical condition, medical personnel had gotten to her on time. A few days later, Kim Rico was released from the hospital. Police were there waiting.
Are you Kimberly Rico? Okay, right now I have a warrant for your arrest.
She was taken into custody and charged with murder.
You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to return to the camp.
Based on the evidence, investigators believe that Kimberly Rico was driven by greed and a desire to further her affair. On February 15, 1998, she injected her unsuspecting husband with the untraceable drug succinylcholine. It paralyzed him immediately. She staged the scene to make it appear Stephen had been drinking beer and smoking cigars. Then she set the room on fire. Kimberly Rico was convicted of arson and first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. In Maryland, the circumstantial evidence alone was enough to convict Kim Rico of killing her husband. But in Florida, investigators would need irrefutable scientific proof in order to win a murder conviction. Situated in Bay County, on Florida's coastal panhandle, lies the affluent and peaceful community of Panama Beach.
Mom?
There, around 9 a.m. on the morning of May 30th, 1991, 18-year-old Jennifer Cybers went into her parents' bedroom to wake up her mother, Kay.
Mom?
But Kay wasn't responding. Panicked, Jennifer called her father, Florida State Medical Examiner. He told her not to worry. He was sending help and said he would be there shortly.
Okay. Okay.
Emergency workers and a doctor from the medical examiner's office were dispatched to the scene. Kay was unresponsive and showed no signs of life. The 52-year-old mother of 3 was pronounced dead at the scene, the apparent victim of a heart attack. A Bay County Sheriff's deputy heard the call over the radio and responded to the house.
I'd like to speak to you outside.
He was informed that the death had resulted from natural causes, and he wasn't needed.
I'd like to speak to you outside if I could.
A short while later, the victim's husband, medical examiner Dr. William Cybers, arrived at the house. He learned that his wife of more than 20 years was gone.
Any idea what caused it? Jimmy should be in the room, but I need to get to her. Make sure
Dr. Cybers asked that her body be taken directly to the funeral home. The following day, agents from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement received a call. An anonymous informant was troubled by several irregularities surrounding Kay's death and the actions of her husband. After hearing all of the details, Special Agent Scotty Sanderson agreed to take a closer look at Dr. Cybers.
Certain red flags came up. He was a medical examiner. No autopsy had been performed. Kay Cybers was in apparent good health. He did not call 911 after learning of her distress, and the police were notified and sent to the home, but were asked to leave by staff of Dr. Cybers.
As a medical examiner, Dr. Cybers knows that all unattended deaths require that an autopsy be performed. His wife's was no exception. To find out why he hadn't followed protocol, investigators arranged for an interview.
It's important that an autopsy be conducted. Could you tell me why you didn't order an autopsy?
Dr. Cybers admitted he had made a mistake.
And I just
He was distraught and wasn't thinking clearly.
no better family.
He loved Kay very much,
And heart disease. I tried to convince her.
and her death was completely unexpected.
A few drinks, enjoyed ourselves. Very pleasant.
The night
evening.
before she died, the two had gone out for a nice dinner.
Later on, she felt that she had a little.
I've got a really bad chest pain.
But around 4 a.m., she woke him up.
I can hardly breathe. It hurts when I breathe.
Kay was experiencing pain in her chest and left shoulder.
Stuff out.
Oh, man.
Draw some blood for her.
Dr. Cybers was concerned. Kay had a family history of heart disease and diabetes,
Just try to relax.
but she refused to go to the hospital.
Let me see if I can put your arm down a minute.
Dr. Cybers said he tried to draw some blood so he could have it tested the following morning.
Ouch.
But he said he botched the job.
Just try to relax.
Ow. Ow, Bill.
After 2 unsuccessful attempts, he gave up.
I'll be right back. Lay back.
Eventually, Kay fell back asleep.
She was fine.
Dr. Cybers said he called to check up on her several times the following morning, but he never got through.
See if she wanted to take something for her.
As a matter of routine, Agent Sanderson asked for the syringe,
Explain to me what happened.
but Dr. Cybers didn't have it.
Where's it?
He said that on his way to work the following morning, he tossed the needle in the trash and then disposed of the garbage in a dumpster a few blocks away.
Trash to the dumpster.
Yes.
Is that typically what your family does with the household garbage?
Most of our garbage, yes.
Dr. Cybers, is there...
All of the information, including the manner in which the needle was disposed, troubled Agent Sanderson.
He's a physician. He has a needle on a syringe exposed in a household garbage, throwing it in the garbage bin supposedly down the street. All of these different factors were alarming me and the other agents that were with me about what we were going to be working.
Troubled by all of the irregularities, investigators began looking deeper into Kay Cybers' medical history. FDLE Special Agent Dennis Norred pored over her records, looking for any clue that might help explain her death. He found no record suggesting she suffered from diabetes or heart disease, as her husband claimed.
We had gathered documents from the time that Kay was born up until the time she had died in Panama City. And there was nothing to ever indicate that she would have experienced any type of health problems.
The information suggested that Dr. Cybers was not being truthful about his wife's medical history. To find out why, investigators needed to examine the victim's body. After obtaining a warrant, authorities were dispatched to the funeral home to retrieve Kay's remains. They arrived just in time.
Agents were dispatched to that funeral home where they found she had been embalmed and was in a casket for showing, and they were about to transport her body back to her home in Iowa.
Dr. Cybers, it seemed, was in a hurry to bury his wife. Kay Cybers' body was transported to an independent medical examiner's office located in Pensacola. It was now up to them to determine if her death had resulted from natural causes or something else. Authorities in Bay County, Florida, looked to explain the death of Kay Cybers, a seemingly healthy 52-year-old mother of 3 found dead in her home. Though her husband, medical examiner Dr. William Cybers, claimed she had a history of heart disease and diabetes, her medical records told a different story. Investigators hoped an autopsy would give them answers. Medical examiner Dr. Gary Cumberland looked to pinpoint a specific cause of death. An external examination revealed the presence of 2 distinct puncture marks on the victim's right arm. That was consistent with Dr. Cybers' claim that he tried to draw blood from her shortly before her death. But the marks were also consistent with something being injected into the body.
I'm seeing some fresh hemorrhage around these, so I think that they occurred before she died. So let's make sure that we get some of that tissue for toxicology as well as general histology.
Dr. Cumberland focused his internal examination on the victim's heart. There was no evidence of disease or any signs of damage. In fact, all of the victim's organs seemed healthy. Dr. Cumberland found nothing to explain why Kay Cybers had died so suddenly. Troubled by the findings, he collected tissue and blood samples for further analysis.
Basically, what we have is a person who died with no natural disease process responsible for her death. And in those instances, we start looking for toxicologic agents, i.e., is there some drug or poison that she had been given that resulted in her death?
The samples were forwarded to the Dade County Medical Examiner's office. But toxicologists were at a disadvantage. Kay Cybers' body had been embalmed soon after her death, and those fluids had likely destroyed any traces of drugs or poisons that may have been injected into her system. Test results turned up negative. The findings did little to ease investigators' suspicions that Kay Cybers had met with foul play.
And we have agents that will be accompanying this material down to my...
Despite the lack of hard evidence, they refused to close the case. Though the victim's husband explained the puncture marks on Kay's arms had resulted from an attempt to draw blood, investigators formulated a different theory. They speculated he had injected her with a lethal drug. But a search of dumpsters near the couple's house failed to produce a syringe or any evidence that could prove it. Investigators turned to the couple's children, hopeful they could shed light on a possible motive for murder. But the Cybers' daughter insisted that her parents' relationship was strong.
She seemed normal, seemed fine.
Her father was dedicated to Kay and the children. The daughter said she had last seen her mother the night before she died.
Yeah. Wonderful. We went to that new restaurant with Mama's.
When her parents returned home from dinner, they seemed happy and both were in good moods.
Okay. Good night, Daddy. I'll be up in a little bit.
She and her mother stayed up and talked for some time.
It was good. It was really good. School was fun.
None of the children believed that their father had anything to do with their mother's death.
Appreciate you coming in. Thank you.
The investigation was going nowhere.
Dearly beloved, we do thank you for coming today.
Authorities had no choice but to release the victim's body to her family.
Every one of you here with us today.
Kay Cybers' remains were flown to her hometown in Iowa. There, she was laid to rest. But agents refused to give up. They scoured through the case files, looking for anything they may have overlooked. In his statements to police, Dr. Cybers claimed he had tried to telephone his wife numerous times on the morning of her death to check on her. Investigators subpoenaed his cell phone records and found he was telling the truth. But FDLE agent Dennis Norrid noticed something else.
Over about a 3-month time period, there were approximately 140 some odd calls made from Dr. Cybers to a particular phone number.
2 of those calls took place on the morning of Kay's death. The number was traced to a former lab technician who worked with Dr. Cybers. The woman admitted that the 2 were close friends.
At the hospital, I cared for him.
He had called her the day of Kay's death, but she said he was grief-stricken and just wanted to be consoled.
We weren't romantically involved.
But investigators sensed she wasn't telling them everything.
Yes, I do.
Under persistent questioning, she admitted she and Dr. Cybers were romantically involved.
So how's work today?
Initially, she considered him a father figure.
A little bit busy.
Same here.
But as they began spending more time together, her feelings for him deepened. And soon, they fell in love.
Same thing that I felt when we glanced at each other's eyes.
How do you relate to him?
No.
She didn't believe he was capable of murder. Investigators disagreed.
And is he your immediate...
Dr. Cybers wasn't the dedicated husband and father he portrayed himself to be. They theorized he had murdered his wife in order to clear the way to pursue his affair. Police forwarded Kay Cybers' tissue samples collected at Autopsy to the National Medical Services Lab in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, one of the most advanced forensic labs in the country. There, renowned toxicologist Dr. Frederick Reeders agreed to look into the case.
Cybers case, medium and calcium.
And after reviewing Kay Cybers' autopsy report, he found a potential clue. An elevated level of potassium had been detected in her eye fluid. Though potassium occurs naturally in the body in small amounts, if a large dose is injected into a person's bloodstream, it will cause the heart to stop immediately. In the normal human body, potassium and iron are found in equal amounts within red blood cells. To find out if Kay Cybers had an unnatural amount of potassium in her body, toxicologists used a newly developed system that measures the ratio of potassium to iron. the procedure was successful. Dr. Reeders reviewed the findings.
The ratio of potassium to iron in critical areas were much higher than normal, which led me to the conclusion that potassium had been administered to this person, and that was potentially a cause of death for it.
The findings had provided powerful evidence that Kay Cybers had not died of natural causes. But to confirm the results, examiners needed additional samples from the victim's body. For investigators, that presented a problem. In the state of Iowa, where Kay Cybers was buried, state law will only allow a body to be exhumed if the family gives its consent.
But those were the ones that were prescribed.
Dr. Cybers, who insisted he had nothing to hide, refused to give his permission. Desperate not to let their case slip away, authorities turned to Florida State's Attorney Harry Shorstein for help. He agreed to prosecute the case.
Thank you.
But almost immediately, he faced a crushing setback. The only scientific evidence that could prove murder had been challenged by defense experts. Because potassium occurs naturally in the body, the judge ruled that without additional samples, there was insufficient evidence to prove that Kay Cybers had been administered a lethal dosage.
Very simply stated, when you die, your red blood cells almost immediately break down. They're full of potassium, and as a result, the potassium within your body goes everywhere. And the general thought among the scientific community is that if you're injected with potassium, unless you could get to the body almost immediately, you couldn't distinguish between the potassium that had been injected in the body and the potassium that is within your body naturally.
Despite the court's conclusions, everything authorities had learned convinced them Dr. Cybers had murdered his wife. But until they could find irrefutable evidence, they would be unable to prove it. Several years had gone by since the 1991 death of 52-year-old Kay Cybers. Though toxicology tests convinced Florida authorities that her husband had injected her with a lethal dose of potassium, the court ruled the findings were inadmissible. Still, Special Prosecutor Harry Shorstein didn't believe that Kay Cybers died of heart disease, as her husband, medical examiner William Cybers, had suggested.
The examination of the heart that had taken place at the autopsy showed no indication whatsoever of any heart disease, and we were going to proceed with the trial without an actual cause of death, just based on the circumstantial evidence.
In February of 1997, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Dr. William Cybers. He had since retired and married the woman he had been having an affair with. He voluntarily turned himself in to police. Because of health problems, he was released on $300,000 bail, but not before being fitted with an electronic monitoring device. He was only allowed to leave his home to visit attorneys and to attend church. With the trial approaching, prosecutors struggled to prepare their case for a jury.
We've received all of your test results.
Then, they received some unexpected news. In the years since Kay Cybers' death, toxicologists at the National Medical Services Lab in Willow Groves, Pennsylvania, had developed new forensic tests that could detect previously untraceable poisons. Though the samples collected at autopsy were several years old, according to Dr. Kevin Ballard, they had been well preserved.
The tissues from Ms. Cybers were taken from her at the time of her original autopsy, but she had already been embalmed. Those tissues, those organs, were maintained frozen during all the years between the time of her death and the time of our analyses.
First, Dr. Ballard wanted to test the samples for the presence of paralyzing drugs. These drugs are known to increase potassium levels in the body, which might explain why high levels of potassium were found in Kay's tissue samples years earlier. He subjected the samples to a process called QTOF, which stands for quadrupole time of flight. Essentially, the process acts as a molecular microscope. First, all of the molecules that are present in the sample are separated. Each individual molecule is then broken down into pieces. Using sophisticated detection equipment, the individual pieces are then weighed. The molecular weight of the samples is then compared to the molecular weight of known paralyzing drugs. In tissue samples taken from Kay Cyber's kidney, the analysis revealed lethal amounts of the drug succinylcholine.
Succinylcholine and these other paralyzing drugs, when they're administered to a person, they paralyze the skeletal muscles of our bodies. These are the muscles that move our limbs. They also paralyze the specialized skeletal muscle, which is the diaphragm, which is the primary muscle that we use when we breathe. So part of the effect is to stop a person's breathing.
Done the preliminary interviews of the family members.
The analysis had finally given investigators the evidence they needed to prove murder. As a physician, the victim's husband had easy access to the drug and the knowledge to use it with deadly effect. Driven by the desire to further his affair and to avoid a costly divorce, police believe that on May 30th, 1991, Dr. William Cybers injected his wife with a lethal amount of the paralyzing drug. He then tried to use his position as chief medical examiner to conceal his crime.
State of Florida versus William.
In January 2000, Dr. William Cybers was convicted of the murder of his wife, Kay.
So we all done at Pensacola, Escambia County, Florida.
He was sentenced to life in prison.
Date 3/23/2001.
Some killers believe that by using an untraceable drug, their crimes will go unpunished. But with each advance in forensic science, there are fewer poisons that can escape detection. And that means a better chance for investigators to solve those once elusive cases of toxic death. A car bomb hurls investigators down a dark and twisted path. At the end is one woman with many deadly secrets. A bustling emergency room is brought to its knees with the arrival of a dying woman. Scientists try to determine what might have turned her blood to toxic gas. A Florida family is mysteriously sickened. The mother suffers a lingering death. Before police can catch the killer, they must first find the source of the poison. The most subtle of killers is absolutely silent, working from the inside out to turn its victim's body against itself. When chemistry goes wrong, scientists struggle to determine what constitutes a lethal dosage. June 28, 1983, began as a night of celebration. Judy Bueno Año met her boyfriend, John Gentry, and the women who worked at her beauty salon at a Pensacola, Florida restaurant. They gathered to present one of the employees with a pendant in honor of her birthday. As the dinner was finished and the party wore down, Judy suggested that John go to the liquor store for some champagne so they could continue celebrating elsewhere. As night fell, the streets grew quiet. But the silence would be shattered in an instant. Police and rescue raced to the scene. Gentry was rushed to the hospital, shrapnel embedded in his back. At first, investigators weren't sure if the explosion was due to mechanical failure or an attempt on Gentry's life. But even a cursory look at the crime scene revealed the blast to be no accident. It came from the trunk, an unlikely place for an explosion of that magnitude. Because bombings are a federal offense, Pensacola police notified the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. By the extent of the blast, ATF agents estimated 2 sticks of dynamite were used, rigged to the taillights by yellow and orange wire. Gentry was lucky to have escaped with his life. As the ATF investigated the scene and the crime photos, Pensacola police sought to find out who would benefit from Gentry's death. That task fell to Detective Ted Chamberlain.
What we usually do is we look into insurance policies of the victim, and that's what we did with Gentry. And we looked into and we found he did have a large insurance policy on him.
The beneficiary was Judy Bueno Año, Gentry's girlfriend. But that wasn't surprising. The two were starting a business together. By itself, the information meant nothing. Chamberlain needed more to go on. The ATF found it. They traced the dynamite to a man in Alabama, a very close friend of Judy Bueno Año. By now, Gentry was out of intensive care. Detectives took the opportunity to talk to him about what happened, to let him know that Judy Bueno Año was the main suspect. Gentry found it difficult to believe, but then he began thinking about it.
He said, you know, when I'm staying over there at Judy's house, she was giving me these pills, vitamins to make me feel better. And he said, I kept getting sick. He said, so I quit taking them. And then I felt better. He said, and I took them again and got sick again.
Gentry had been so ill, he'd spent time in the hospital. There, he recovered completely, though his doctor wasn't sure what was wrong with him. Once Gentry returned home, he relapsed. Finally, he stopped taking the vitamin pills, and his health returned. He felt his days of illness were behind him. And then his car blew up. Sensing a connection, the detective asked Gentry if he'd saved any of the capsules. As a matter of fact, he had. They were supposedly a popular vitamin C supplement. Chamberlain sent them to the lab for analysis. Finding out what something isn't is easier than finding out what it is. The process of elimination began with a comparison of the capsules with vitamin C. It proved there was not a speck of the vitamin in the capsules. That discovery alone ramped up the suspicion that the pills were poisoned. But what was in them? The substance in the capsules was dissolved and tested. Some tests analyzed its chemical makeup, others measured the wavelengths of light it absorbed. By comparing these results with a database of chemicals, the compound was identified. The capsules were found to contain a substance called paraformaldehyde. It has no known medical use. In fact, it's considered a Class 3 poison, which means it's moderately toxic. John Trestrail of the Blodgett Poison Control Center is a poisoning expert. According to him, if murder was the motive, paraformaldehyde wasn't the best choice.
When it breaks down to formaldehyde, which we know is used to preserve bodies, is very irritating. It wouldn't be a very good poison to pick for homicidal reasons. It'd be more irritating, irritating to the eyes, irritating to the respiratory tract. And I suppose in chronic exposures, we know formaldehyde can cause cancer.
Gentry's story, bolstered by the tampered pills and the explosion, gave Chamberlain ample grounds to obtain search warrants for Bueno Año's home and beauty salon. At her house, they found more vitamin capsules.
Coming right up.
Okay. I'll check the closet. Yeah, I had something like that when I was a kid. The basket. Oh, I got something.
In her son's closet, they found wire that resembled the wire used to blow up the car.
Look at this. What you got? Got a wire here. My gloves.
So we sent that off to the lab, and they sent us back pictures of the wire and the color coding and striations of the wire. One taken from the piece of the bomb that was gone, and the one from the boy's room, and you put them together, it was just like matching up ballistics on bullets. I mean, they looked exactly alike, and that was real good evidence.
Hi, I'm Detective Robert Beasley. This is an official investigation.
While one group of officers searched the house, another group was at work collecting chemicals from Bueno Año's salon.
I'm not sure either, but let's back.
For Judy Bueno Año, paraformaldehyde would be a poison of opportunity.
Be careful with it, don't.
The chemical is used in beauty salons as a disinfectant. With evidence of the bomb and the poison, police had ample grounds to arrest her on suspicion. The bombing made her a suspect in a federal crime. The ATF's jurisdiction stretched beyond Florida to all 50 states. Having failed at both poisoning and blowing up her lover, Bueno Año seemed like a two-time loser. But as investigators checked her background, they began to suspect that she may have just been in a slump. As news of Judy Bueno Año's arrest spread, Detective Chamberlain received a call from the mother of one of her ex-boyfriends in Alabama, a man named Bobby Joe Morris, a man who had died mysteriously.
Her son and Judy lived together, and she had a very strong suspicion that he didn't die of natural causes, that she had poisoned or killed her son.
Bueno Año had pressured Bobby Joe's mother to cremate the body, but she refused. Chamberlain promised he'd look into the matter.
Everybody that we talked to, they all seemed to be a little bit scared of Judy, a little bit afraid of her, that she would always make up these incredible stories is what we were hearing from her. And we even talked to one witness that the witness said that Judy had told this girl, said, look, if you don't like your husband, poison him.
With stories of Bobby Joe Morris and others coming to light, police began to suspect that John Gentry wasn't Bueno Año's first victim. They found that her life, at least on the surface, appeared touched by tragedy. But a closer inspection suggested something more diabolical. Judy lost her husband, James Goodyear, in 1971. 3 months after he returned from Vietnam, he lapsed into delirium and died.
What a great day for a stakeout.
After his death, Judy changed her name from Judy Goodyear to Judy Bueno Año, the Spanish translation of her husband's surname. The deeper Chamberlain dug, the darker Judy's past became. Bodies were beginning to tumble out of her closet.
You'd open up one door and go in it, and it would lead to about 5 or 6 more doors. That was the problem with her. You know, it didn't look like it was ever going to stop. You know, we kept finding bodies everywhere.
One of those bodies was her own son, Michael Goodyear. He joined the Army in 1979. Shortly after visiting his mother while on leave, he became ill. Tests showed exposure to arsenic. Because his job involved working with the substance, it was assumed that he'd inadvertently ingested some. He soon began to lose the use of his arms and legs, and he was discharged. His first day home, Judy and her youngest son took Michael on a canoe trip near their home. Despite the fact that Michael wore heavy braces, he had no life jacket. In the middle of the lake, the boat capsized and Michael drowned. Back then, it seemed like a tragic, if stupid, accident. But now, Chamberlain wasn't so certain. Too many men in Judy Bueno Año's life had come to an untimely end. A sinister pattern was taking shape. While Judy awaited her day in court for the attempted murder of John Gentry, Chamberlain gathered evidence of homicide she may have gotten away with, at least so far. He learned that Judy's husband, James Goodyear, showed symptoms consistent with any number of illnesses, among them arsenic poisoning. If he was poisoned, the evidence was buried with him. 12 years after his death, his body was ordered exhumed to look for proof.
When you exhume a body looking for one of the heavy metals like lead, thallium, arsenic, antimony, these are all elements. Elements have been around since the solar system was created. They're just as detectable today as they were 250 million years ago and 250 million years down the road from now. So when you talk about digging up a body looking for arsenic, if it was in that body when it went in the ground, it's going to be in that body until it disintegrates.
Goodyear had been autopsied at the time of his death, but the medical examiner wasn't looking for poison, so he didn't find any. Almost anything can be poisonous if enough is swallowed, so no single test can be used to detect all poisons. The analyst must be guided by his knowledge of the symptoms so he can narrow the field and test for specific poisons. Arsenic tends to concentrate in the heart, liver, lungs, and kidneys. Samples of each were tested for the toxin. Arsenic can take down a person in an hour or a year, depending on how much he ingests. A single large dose kills quicker than small doses over a longer time. A faster death means the poison would have less time to damage organs. Goodyear's lingering death suggested cumulative long-term poisoning. The ravaged condition of his organs bore that out. The diagnosis was crucial and incriminating because it made accidental poisoning less likely. Since James and Judy Goodyear lived in the same house, it seemed reasonable that they'd both be exposed to arsenic if the hazard were present. But Judy never showed any symptoms. Next, the medical examiner set out to determine how much arsenic was present in Goodyear's system. The victim's hair and nails provided a handy yardstick. A complete fingernail was removed from the nail bed and dissolved in acid. The resulting solution was put in an instrument called an atomic absorption spectrometer that determines the concentration of arsenic in the sample. The amount of arsenic a person swallows is proportional to the amount in the victim's hair and nails. The medical examiner could tell that the levels were too high to have come from the environment. And since hair grows at a set rate, he could use it to see how long Goodyear had been given the poison. He determined that the contaminated portion of the hair was consistent with 3 months' growth. James Goodyear had been home from the Navy 3 months before he died. The evidence suggested that Judy had wasted no time doing away with her husband. Shortly after James Goodyear's autopsy, Judy's boyfriend and second suspected victim, Bobby Joe Morris, was exhumed. His hair and nails contained enough arsenic to kill 11 men. It appeared that over a 12-year period, Judy Bueno Año managed to fatally poison 2 men and poison and drown a third. Other men in her life had also met mysterious ends, but she was never prosecuted for their deaths. The motive in every case was insurance money. Ironically, it was the one who got away, John Gentry, that ultimately exposed her deadly game. Her botched attempt to poison him forced her to resort to using a bomb. On the surface, the choice may seem bizarre, but to poison expert John Trestrail, the difference between bombs and poisons is only a matter of degree.
I personally believe there's a great similarity between the psychological profile of a bomber and a poisoner. Because what is a poison other than a chemical bomb? It doesn't make any noise. The effect is the same. You blow up the victim.
Poisoning is more subtle and may at first go undetected. But there's no statute of limitations on murder, and poison leaves its traces for a very long time. One clue is all it takes to expose the truth.
And of course, every poisoner looks for the perfect poison that's undetectable. And my answer is, what would you call it? If it's got a name, don't you have to see something to name it? And if you see it, is it not detectable? So there is no perfect, non-detectable poison.
Judy Bueno Año received 12 years for bombing Gentry's car, life in prison for the drowning death of her son, and is on death row for poisoning her husband. For the death of Bobby Joe Morris, there was simply no punishment left to give her. She is one of only 48 women ever sentenced to death in the United States. It took years for Bueno Año's methodical poisonings to catch up with her, but once her villainy was revealed, the evidence was irrefutable. Across the country, scientists faced a more perplexing dilemma. How could the body of a dying woman poison the staff of an emergency room? Just after 8 p.m. on February 9, 1994, paramedics whisked 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez into the emergency room at California's Riverside Hospital. Her boyfriend called because she collapsed and had trouble breathing. The paramedics related to the ER staff that the patient had cervical cancer, but she hadn't yet begun chemotherapy. In fact, there was nothing in her record to prepare the ER for what was to come. When Ramirez arrived at the emergency room, she already had an oxygen mask on her face. Then her heart rhythm began to fluctuate, and the staff tried to shock it back to normal. It wasn't working. A nurse drew blood to run some tests. And that's when the well-choreographed chaos of the emergency room began to fall to pieces. Ramirez's body began to take on an oily sheen. The nurse drawing the blood complained of a strange odor. She handed the hypodermic to a physician. Then she passed out. The odor, something like garlic or ammonia, increased. Beige crystals were noticed in the blood sample. Suddenly, another nurse fell. In short order, another nurse became dizzy and went to the nurses' station to rest. There, she lost consciousness. Her arms and legs began to shake uncontrollably. Occasionally, she'd stop breathing. Then one of the doctors succumbed. Ramirez was still not stabilized. An emergency was declared as attendants rushed in to clear the collapsing staff and attend to Ramirez. As the emergency room was evacuated, gurneys were wheeled into the parking lot. Unable to cope with the bizarre onslaught, Riverside sent its staff and patients to other hospitals. The caregivers suddenly became the patients. Bedlam ruled, and at its center lay a helpless, dying woman. Within 15 minutes of contact with Gloria Ramirez, 27 of the 37 staff members at Riverside Hospital suffered strange symptoms. Respiratory therapist Maureen Welch was one of them.
After I awoke, outside was very sick. Uncontrollable tremors, nausea, retching, difficulty breathing. My vision felt kind of limited at that time. I could only see things close to me.
There was simply no explaining what could have caused the symptoms. Many of those affected recovered quickly. Others spent weeks in the hospital. Within 35 minutes of Ramirez's arrival at the hospital, she was pronounced dead. The crisis had passed, but the mystery deepened.
35.
Her body was sealed in 2 plastic bags and an airtight casket before being moved to the hospital morgue. To find the cause of the catastrophe, the Riverside Hazardous Materials, or HAZMAT team, arrived suited for battle. Ductwork, sewage lines, plumbing, and waste disposal were thoroughly checked. The air in the emergency room was electronically sniffed for toxic gases, solvents, or chemicals. Nothing was overlooked, and nothing could explain what happened. Once the emergency room was given a clean bill of health, suspicions turned to the patient. An autopsy revealed nothing extraordinary. Gloria Ramirez died of kidney failure as a result of her cancer. Dissatisfied with the findings and desperate for an explanation, hospital officials sent blood and tissue samples from Ramirez to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, 60 miles east of San Francisco. Solvents were added to Ramirez's blood sample. Organic chemicals in the blood were dissolved, leaving water and blood cells behind. The result is a highly concentrated extract of the chemicals in the blood. Brian Andresen is the director of the center.
Here in our laboratory are very precise analytical tools that allow us to look at every chemical that we extracted from the blood sample and actually determine the chemical structure and even get concentrations, all down at ultra-low concentrations.
Identifying the chemicals took a 2-pronged approach. First, the extract of Ramirez's blood was heated in a gas chromatograph until it vaporized. Because every chemical vaporizes at a different rate, the components separated. The spectrometer then identified each chemical by reading the patterns of light they emitted. The results were then plotted on a computer in the form of peaks and valleys. What would Ramirez's blood reveal?
Every peak here is a different, unique chemical that was in the blood of Mrs. Ramirez. And things stand out, it's very obvious. This is all Tylenol or acetaminophen is right here. Cholesterol is here, other drugs, and a very unusual chemical that we initially discovered, which was right here. We don't know what it is at this moment, but luckily we have libraries that when you actually search a library, in the computer it will print out what this chemical is.
It turned out to be a high concentration of a chemical called dimethylsulfone, or DMSO2. It comes from the breakdown of another chemical, DMSO, or dimethyl sulfoxide. Though it's manufactured as an industrial lubricant, DMSO is used by thousands of athletes and arthritis sufferers to relieve pain. It's conceivable that Ramirez was using it for this purpose. But its waste product, DMSO2, is not toxic, even in the high concentrations found in her tissues. Its presence did nothing to explain why the emergency room was brought to its knees. From his findings, Andresen had to conclude he'd found nothing to account for the harrowing events on the night Ramirez died. Without any physical explanation for what was now being called the Ramirez incident, the California Department of Health Services wrote it off to mass hysteria due to stress. The healthcare workers were not buying it.
My response to the claim of mass hysteria was not something that I can entertain personally, because the people involved in emergency care, and in particular this emergency room, were all like a well-oiled machine. They'd all had tons of experience, 15 or years better, veterans of all types of occurrences, and this was just something else that they had to take care of. And you can't argue with that. I mean, these people are not generally hysterical.
Unwilling to accept the ruling of the health department, Welch did some homework of her own. She knew that many of her colleagues, and she herself, had suffered long-term health problems, not the sort of symptoms induced by mass hysteria. She gathered up lab reports, medical records, and contacted Brian Andresen. Andresen and his colleague, Deputy Director Patrick Grant, looked over the data Welch sent them. They focused on the one compound that didn't seem to fit.
Basically, I came back into my office and started looking up compounds in the Chemist's Bible, the Merck Index. Looked up dimethyl sulfoxide and dimethyl sulfone, and fortunately, they're right there together in language even a nuclear chemist can understand. And at that point, I realized that oxidation was the connector between the two.
If Ramirez was taking DMSO on her own to relieve her pain, it seemed plausible the extra oxygen she was given on the way to the hospital could have sped the chemical's transformation to its waste product, DMSO2. DMSO is oily and has a garlicky smell. That could explain the sheen on Ramirez's skin and the odor in the emergency room. But it didn't explain why so many people were sickened. Pat Grant began to formulate a theory. On the same page in the drug manual as DMSO and DMSO2 was an entry for DMSO4. The only difference between the two compounds was more oxygen, but it was a crucial difference. DMSO2 is a harmless vapor. DMSO4 is a deadly nerve gas.
And if you read the toxicities and the various symptoms that people that are exposed to dimethyl sulfate experience, it was quite similar to the Riverside incident.
Grant's theory sounded good on paper, but no one had ever turned harmless DMSO2 into deadly DMSO4 in the lab by simply adding more oxygen. If Grant was asserting that a dying woman could somehow change into a canister of nerve gas, he was going to have to prove it. The scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory had a daunting task ahead of them. To see if DMSO2 could turn into its deadly cousin, DMSO4, in the emergency room, they had to replicate the conditions during the last few minutes of Gloria Ramirez's life. The work was assigned to analytical chemist Rich Whipple. The first obstacle was the nature of the two substances. While harmless DMSO2 dissolves in blood, deadly DMSO4 doesn't. So how could the compound be in Ramirez's veins? The answer is, it couldn't.
Our belief is that she had DMSO2 in the blood, and then when it was withdrawn from her system, it was then converted to DMSO4.
The chemical event, if it happened at all, happened in the syringe. Using a substitute for human blood, Whipple performed an experiment to show how a change in temperature could change the form of the chemical. At body temperature, DMSO2 stays dissolved in the solution. But cooled to room temperature, it forms crystals. Crystals like the ones witnessed by some of the emergency room staff. In her body, Ramirez's blood was 98.6 degrees. But the portion drawn into the syringe was immediately cooled to around 64 degrees, the temperature of the emergency room. The drastic temperature change may have caused the DMSO2 crystals to separate out. Everything about the theory seemed to be holding together except one crucial point. Whipple didn't manage to produce any detectable DMSO4. But lab tests can never perfectly replicate a real-life situation. In the emergency room, only the slightest amount of DMSO4 would have been needed to sicken all those staffers. 1/10 of a gram of the substance can be lethal. In smaller doses, DMSO4 can cause long-term nerve damage and other lingering health problems. A year or more after the Ramirez incident, some of the staffers in the emergency room still had symptoms. Grant believes this is further evidence in favor of a chemical explanation, not mass hysteria or some other psychological cause.
In comparison to the other theories that were out there before we proposed our chemical theory, I would believe it over mass hysteria of an experienced emergency room staff.
Though Grant's findings are generally accepted, many scientists await further proof before they're convinced. Until the mechanism for the deadly transformation is fully understood, there remains a slim chance that the Ramirez incident could happen again. The events in Riverside's emergency room highlight how toxic hazards can come from the least likely sources. That's a fact poisoners use to their advantage. Since anything can be a poison, the killer can hide his weapon in plain sight. At 7 a.m., October 23, 1988, Peggy Carr arrived at a restaurant in Alturas, Florida, where she worked as a waitress. As she waited for her shift to start, she began to feel ill. Soon, her legs started to burn, and pain racked her chest. She thought she was having a heart attack. One of the regulars, a former Army medic, checked her pulse and reassured her that whatever was ailing her, it wasn't her heart. But the pain continued to grow. Peggy was sent home to rest. The pain was unrelenting, and Peggy's family sent her to the hospital. She was admitted and placed under observation. 16 hours after her first symptoms, Peggy Carr was practically incapacitated, and her physician was stumped. 3 days and a battery of tests later, doctors were no closer to making a diagnosis. Then, just as mysteriously as they had begun, Peggy's symptoms began to fade. She was sent home.
And my chest is real tight.
But within a week, the crushing pain gripped her again. She was rushed back to the hospital. Besides the intense pain in her limbs and joints, her hair began to fall out, and she was becoming unable to move. Tests still showed nothing wrong with her. Doctors thought some virus had nestled in her nervous system. She told her neurologist that she felt like she was walking on hot coals. The description brought to mind something he'd only read about. He decided to try one more test for thallium poisoning. Thallium is a natural element found in trace amounts in soil and water. Its purified form is strictly regulated. Up until 1972, when it was banned in the United States, it was used in rat and ant poisons. Tests showed that Peggy Carr's system had 20,000 times the amount of thallium one might expect to find. The poison was eating away her nervous system. There was no cure. At first, Peggy's poisoning was considered accidental.
The girls from church.
Tests on her family revealed that everyone in the Carr household had traces of it.
Oh, we can't decide.
The Polk County Sheriff's Department and the Health Department combed the Carr's house to find the source of the contaminant. Detective Ernie Mincy led the investigation.
Our sole purpose was to identify that poison and have it removed from the environment to prevent further injury to any of the persons.
Over the next month, investigators collected food, water, and soil samples in the Carr's home and neighborhood. Everything was sent to the lab to be tested. After an impatient wait, every test came back negative. Investigators were desperate to find the source of the poison. Meanwhile, Peggy could no longer breathe on her own and lapsed into a coma. The search for the poison continued. How many others would be sickened before it was found? Among the items collected from the Carr's house were returnable bottles of Coca-Cola. One of them was broken. All had residue on the bottom. Like everything else, they were sent off for analysis. The bottles joined the ranks of dozens of items collected from the Carr's house. Each had been subjected to the same test. Each had been eliminated. Investigators hoped to have better luck with the bottles. To test for thallium, the residue was dissolved in nitric acid. A sample was placed in a graphite tube and vaporized. Then, a lamp with a thallium filament was shined into the tube. The test relies on the principle that every compound emits a specific wavelength of light. An instrument called a spectrophotometer measured the amount of light absorbed by the sample. It showed that the bottles contained more than 11 times the level of the toxin one might expect to find. Finally, the source of the poison had been found. But how did thallium get into the soft drink? Were others out there waiting to be consumed? Mincy feared a manufacturing catastrophe or malicious tampering. With the assistance of the FBI and the Coca-Cola Company, the lot numbers were traced back to the store, the warehouse, and the bottling plant. The search came up clean. No other bottles had been tainted, and there'd been no other reports of poisoning. The tainted bottles were specific to the Carr's home. But who would have done it? A poisoner must have intimate contact with his victim's surroundings in order to plant the toxin. That's why most poisonings are done within families.
That's up for grabs.
And that's why suspicion fell on Pye Carr. Pye was Peggy's second husband. They'd been married only a few months when Peggy grew ill, but it seemed their honeymoon was long over. Mincy learned that just prior to the poisoning, the Carrs had an argument that resulted in Peggy spending the night in a hotel. The weekend her symptoms first appeared, Pye was conveniently out of town on a hunting trip. When he returned, he'd resisted taking his wife to the hospital. Everything seemed to point to Pye Carr. But convictions aren't made on such circumstantial evidence. Mincy's criminal investigation had just begun. More evidence needed to be gathered. More leads followed.
It's in here somewhere, fellas.
Carr's every move was scrutinized. Almost as an afterthought, he presented a convenient clue in his own defense. He showed detectives a threatening note he claimed he received 2 weeks before the poisoning. The Carrs didn't pay much attention to it at the time, but Pye kept it just in case.
This note indicated that everyone who had written it wanted the entire family to move out of the state of Florida or else they would die.
The note, along with the fact that Pye Carr had consumed some of the tainted soft drink, weakened the accusations against him. But he wasn't home free yet. He could have written the note himself and taken the poison intentionally to deflect the pall of guilt. Mincy kept his eye on Pye Carr while he sought other suspects. Who would want to kill the family? Mincy learned that the Carrs didn't get along with their neighbors, George Trepal and his wife Diana. Several weeks before the poisoning, Peggy and Diana almost came to blows over the Carrs' loud music. It hardly seemed like grounds for attempted murder. To find out more about the icy relationship between the neighbors, Mincy paid a visit to George Trepal. Trepal's reaction to the subject of the Carrs was unexpectedly harsh.
He went into a tirade about the problems with these red-necked children and family that lived next door to him.
Their kids make all kinds of noise, play the radio real loud.
Then Mincy asked him why he thought anyone might want to harm the family.
He quoted the threatening letter the Carrs had received weeks before verbatim. He said exactly what was in the note. Nobody else knew of its existence, nobody else except law enforcement.
At that moment, George Trepal became the prime suspect. But Mincy had no more to go on with Trepal than he had with Pye Carr. So he began looking into Trepal's surprising past. Trepal was an eccentric man who enjoyed creating games and crafting scenarios. He also belonged to Mensa, an elite society of people whose IQs are among the top 2% in the world. He and his wife were trained chemists. What's more, the quirky genius had done time for masterminding one of the largest amphetamine manufacturing operations in the Southeast. Thallium is sometimes used to make amphetamines. According to John Trestrail, Trepal had the means and the mind to orchestrate a poisoning.
They can plan a script of a death. She'll be here and she'll be eating this, and then she'll do this, and I'll do this, and it's all laid out. So I think this takes a great deal of intelligence to plan this out. This is not a brute force weapon. This is mind, not muscle.
But what would his motive be? In his prison records, Mincy found a letter Trepal wrote complaining to officials about his fellow inmates' radios. As hard as it was to believe, loud music seemed to be an overwhelming sore point for him. On March 3rd, 1989, Peggy Carr died after lingering in a coma for 3 months. Mincy now had to prove that Trepal was a murderer. With nothing but the flimsiest circumstantial evidence, Mincy couldn't get a search warrant for Trepal's house. The only way to crack this case was to outsmart the certified genius. After several months of background checks on George Trepal, Detective Mincy was confident he poisoned Peggy Carr. All he needed was proof. But Trepal was too clever to leave clues out in the open. Mincy needed to get inside his house and get inside his head. To carry it off, he needed someone to befriend the alleged killer, win his confidence, and then betray it. For this deadly game, he counted on Special Agent Susan Gorick. She became Sherry Gwynn, a woman on the verge of divorce who counted on Trepal's shoulders to cry on. She met him at a party that he organized for Mensa members. Its theme was murder.
I learned a lot about his personality and about his habits, about his associates. One of the things that I learned was that he did have a large ego. I did use my personality of Sherry to play off of that ego and to get him to talk more. And I used that to my advantage.
The friendship blossomed slowly, forcing Gorick to maintain her Sherry Gwynn persona for a full year. All the while, she lived in fear that Trepal would see through her masquerade, putting her life in danger. Slowly, she gathered what evidence she could to build her case, hoping he'd tip his hand. As the months went by, she didn't have much.
I gained a multitude of small evidence, small statements that all put together was overwhelming. But if you looked at one small statement, it did not look like a lot of evidence.
Like playing an excruciating game of hangman, Gorick slowly drew her picture of Trepal as the murderer. But even after a year, she was still waiting to add that final stroke essential to win the game. Finally, in December 1989, Gorick got the break she needed. Trepal and his wife moved out of town and allowed Sherry Gwynn to rent their house. As a tenant, she could search the entire property without a warrant. She'd gotten all she could out of Trepal. Perhaps now his house would give up his secrets. She called in the Polk County Crime Scene Unit. They combed the premises, collecting whatever they could find. Believing Trepal would be too smart to have kept any thallium around his house, they looked for its telltale residue.
I truly believed that if we were going to find thallium, that it would probably be either in the air conditioning filter or possibly down one of the drains. And we spent a lot of time with the crime scene people swabbing the drains, trying to get any residue that he may have poured out.
While some investigators were in the house looking for trace evidence, others collected vials of chemicals from the garage. Everything was labeled and sent to the FBI for analysis. Months went by before the results came back.
I assumed because it took so long with the lab report that they didn't find anything.
But Gorick was wrong. When the reports came back, they showed that one of the vials, picked up from the workbench in Trepal's garage, contained thallium powder. For Gorick and Mincy, 15 months of deception paid off. The evidence to convict George Trepal of poisoning the cars was in hand. At Trepal's trial, it was clear that he was a killer without a conscience. Like the murder weekend party he organized, death was just a game to him.
George Trepal had absolutely no remorse for his actions. He justified it with his superior intelligence and the fact that people with lesser intelligence did not deserve to live on this planet.
Unlike most poisoners, Trepal's motive was neither love nor money. He wanted to kill his neighbors simply because he found them annoying. According to John Trestrail, the ego that led him to think so little of others ultimately led to his own demise.
The container containing the evidence was left in his home. Why would he do that? Here's a very intelligent man. Didn't he look down the road to say, I better get rid of this bottle? No, his ego said, they'll never get this far. They'll never figure out how this happened.
A jury found George Trepal guilty of 14 felony counts, including first-degree murder in the death of Peggy Carr. He was sentenced to death. As we go about our daily lives, most of us seldom think about the toxic world we live in. In the past, that lack of diligence provided the poisoner's greatest opportunity. But now, science is catching up. More than ever, unexplained deaths are viewed with suspicion. And in the lab, more of those suspicions are being justified. In Washington state, 2 people die agonizing deaths. Both are victims of poison-laced Excedrin capsules. The news causes public panic and costs manufacturers tens of millions of dollars. In Virginia, a cardiac care unit experiences an epidemic of unexpected deaths. Is this bad care or bad luck? Or is it something more sinister? And a man tries to murder his wife in an insurance fraud.
Your emergency? I've got a medical emergency. My wife is going into some kind of convulsion. And her mouth is foaming.
Poisoners are among the most elusive killers. Today, forensic detectives are employing an arsenal of techniques to uncover and convict them. Who is winning the war?
How's Miss Thomas doing?
No, she's doing great.
Good. Let me take her chart. I'm going to down and check on her.
It is 9 o'clock on a Saturday night when Dr. Joseph Whittle makes his final rounds. Whittle is co-director of the Coronary Care Unit at General Hospital in Petersburg, Virginia.
I'm Miss Thomas. I'm Dr. Whittle.
He has been on duty since noon. It is time to go home. Among his patients is Josephine Thomas, a 73-year-old retired teacher. She was admitted with heart problems several hours earlier and now is resting comfortably. At around 11 p.m., Whittle orders an IV.
Miss Thomas? Miss Thomas?
The duty nurse signals a code blue, a patient emergency, and calls in Dr. Whittle. Josephine Thomas is in crisis. It takes Whittle just 15 minutes to return.
Everyone clear? Shocking?
Too late. Josephine Thomas cannot be revived. The death troubles the staff. An epidemic of unexpected deaths has struck the cardiac care unit in the past few weeks. 2 nurses suspect that Josephine Thomas may not have died of natural causes. Their suspicions deepen an hour and a half later, when a package of lidocaine is found to be missing.
Okay, lidocaine 2 gram?
No.
You don't find any 2 gram?
We didn't use a 2 gram.
Right. Well, we should have 1 2 gram lidocaine in.
I don't have one.
Lidocaine is a drug given to stabilize heartbeat. In large concentrations, it can be fatal. Whenever a death seems unusual or suspicious, medical and law enforcement personnel are required to contact the medical examiner's office.
Hi, Dr. Fierro. How are you? Hello, Jim.
Dr. Marcella Fierro is Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Virginia. In her first year as an assistant medical examiner, she worked on the Petersburg case.
The problem arose when it became apparent that there was, one, an increased number of deaths in the unit as compared to previous months, and secondly, that a significant number of them were occurring in the presence of or were being discovered by Leroy Hargrave.
Evening, ladies.
Leroy Hargrave was a 21-year-old nurse's aide whose reputation around the hospital was decidedly mixed. It was Hargrave who had called the alert on Josephine Thomas. Several other deaths had also occurred during Hargrave's shifts. Was this coincidence, or was something else going on? No one had seen Hargrave do anything wrong. It would take all the resources of forensic science to establish what had happened. Throughout the United States, an autopsy is performed whenever the cause of death is unknown. This unknown male was found dead on a Michigan street.
All right, go ahead and check the status of the hair, looking for any injuries on the head.
How did the individual die? Was it natural death, an accident, a homicide, or suicide? Sometimes the answer is undetermined.
You make it to a hospital?
No, not this guy. He was found dead in an older part of town. I'm wondering about lead poisoning. You think we ought to get a heavy metal screen on him?
I think it'd be a good idea.
Why don't we get some head hair too, since arsenic can accumulate in the hair. If we do find arsenic on the general heavy metal screen, then we can fractionate the hair. Since hair grows about 1 centimeter a month, see if there's any chronicity to the poisoning.
Pathologists gather a variety of samples, including muscle tissue, brain, kidney, urine, and blood.
About 30 cc's will be enough, Paul. All right, let's get a piece of kidney too, Paul.
All right.
Each sample may tell a story about the victim's life and death. Poisoning is a rare occurrence, according to James Valentour, head of the Toxicology Laboratory for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Poisoning is not automatically suspected. It depends on the circumstances or lack of other evidence following the investigation. If an autopsy is conducted on a young person in otherwise apparent good health and no cause of death is found, then the suspicion of drug involvement or drug contribution to that death increases, and we proportionally increase our analyses until we rule out all the possibilities that we can.
Today, poison specialists called toxicologists employ a bewildering array of sophisticated technologies. Antibodies, protein substances the body produces to combat foreign matter, are used to detect toxins. To test for cocaine and its metabolic products, for example, blood is mixed with antibodies specific to certain parts of the cocaine molecule. A fluorescent label is added to the mixture. If cocaine is present, the pattern of fluorescence changes. To identify poison compounds, they must be broken down into smaller parts called ions. Dr. Valentour and his colleagues use the most powerful techniques available, which include the gas chromatograph and mass spectrometer, which are often used in combination. Chemicals are added to a sample to separate any organic drugs present from the blood matrix. The isolated portion is vaporized and passed along a hydrogen-filled tube. Molecules of different size migrate through the tube at different rates. As molecules emerge from the tube, their concentration is measured. Next, the mass spectrometer shatters the molecule into ions, its chemical building blocks. A complex molecule may generate hundreds of ion fragments. The pattern of ions produced is unique to a particular molecule. To identify the unknown substance, its ion signature is compared to those of tens of thousands of chemicals in the computer's database. In time, techniques like these would reveal not one, but 6 poisonings at Petersburg General Hospital.
Logic Poison Center, can I help you?
The world is filled with deadly chemicals. An average home harbors dozens of dangerous substances, such as chlorine bleach, drain opener, and aspirin, each capable of causing death. The Blodgett Regional Poison Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan, receives thousands of anxious phone calls each year. Many concern overdoses, accidental or intentional. Many more involve children who have eaten some bright berry or sampled the household bleach. And a few involve deliberate attempts to kill. John Trestrail directs the center and is an authority on poisons and poisoners.
Well, poisoning homicides differ from normal homicides in that there usually are no witnesses. There are no visible signs of trauma. You see no bullet holes, no stab wounds, no bruises. Usually it's very covert, very secret. The evidence is usually lacking. There's no cartridge cases or anything. Often it's missed, and this crime scene is cleaned up.
Trestrail's office reveals a lifetime of fascination with things poisonous.
Take, for example, spiders. We know that this small spider, compared to one big spider here, you say, well, which one's more poisonous? Well, most little kids will say, obviously, the big one. Well, the tarantula is no more worse than being stung by a bee, but the black widow is capable of killing. So size is not always associated with degree of deadliness.
In Trestrail's view, mankind's knowledge of poisons is extremely ancient. In all likelihood, it goes back to making the connection between eating something and getting sick.
Okay, here we have an example of what primitive man might have first associated cause and effect relationships with. Here is a mushroom called the fly agaric, common name, Amanita muscaria. And it contains chemicals that produce hallucinations and a lot of other bad garbage that go with it. But I'm sure at one time in prehistory, man looked at someone eating this and said, what he did when he ate this was it caused these symptoms. And from that they said, this mushroom contains these poisons. I have this knowledge. This knowledge led to mystery and the shadowy figures of the shamans and witch doctors and everything. So the whole history of toxicology began a couple of 100,000 years ago. It was probably the third weapon developed after the stick and the stone, the poison.
The essence of poisoning is stealth. To shoot or strangle a person, the murderer must be present. Poison offers the opportunity of long-distance homicide. There is also the chance that homicide won't be recorded at all, that the death will be deemed due to natural causes. This is what had occurred at Petersburg General Hospital, until Josephine Thomas's death began to arouse suspicions.
The First Lady came in and was autopsied and was found to have serious heart disease, but she also had lethal concentrations of lidocaine in her blood and in her tissues, which she should not have had because she had no order for it in her chart, nor had she been given lidocaine during her code.
Concerned about the rising death rate, the hospital reviewed all the fatalities since Leroy Hargrave had been assigned to the unit.
And they identified 10 persons that they thought might be at risk for lidocaine poisoning.
James Dalton, now a judge, was assistant Commonwealth's attorney in Petersburg when the deaths took place.
I received a call from an attorney. He said, we've got something I hope doesn't exist, but I'm afraid that there's a possibility that there have been a number of people actually killed at the hospital.
Dalton also learned the name of the chief suspect, Leroy Hargrave.
They were on his shift, and his shift may have varied, but he was he moved around, so whenever he was on a shift. But it was a night shift normally that these occurred, and I guess it was not too suspicious initially because I think there is some history of people dying at night more frequently.
So far, the evidence was circumstantial. Hargrave happened to be around when the deaths took place. To convince Dalton, and ultimately a jury, that they were premeditated murders, the medical examiner had to show that the patients had been given lidocaine in unusual amounts. The task was made more difficult because several of the victims had been dead for several months.
It was a toxicological masterpiece as far as detective work because in one case they're working with fresh tissue. In other instances, they had to recover the poison from bodies which had been embalmed and buried. And in the third instance, they had to try and establish sufficient tissue levels in the biopsy samples from the previous autopsies. When it was all over, of those 10 deaths that were suspicious, 6 were established as due to acute lidocaine poisoning.
Prosecutors pieced together a likely scenario leading to Josephine Thomas's death. It begins with Hargrave stealing some lidocaine. Once the cardiac care unit has settled for the night, he slips into Thomas's room unobserved. After loading a hypodermic with a massive dose of lidocaine, he temporarily disables Thomas's cardiac monitor alarm. Within seconds of administering the drug, it will disrupt the rhythm of Thomas's heart, causing a fatal seizure. Then, Hargrave raises the alarm to divert suspicion from himself.
We need some help in here!
Leroy Hargrave was convicted of poisoning Josephine Thomas and sentenced to life imprisonment. He never confessed, and his motive for killing Thomas and the other patients was never established. Dr. Fierro talks about one theory.
The code, the actual code procedure, the cardiac arrest procedure with the response by a resuscitation team is a very dramatic event. It's very intense, it's very rapid. There are orders, there's no pleases, there's no thank yous, there's just instructions. And this is quite exciting to persons who are on the outside, you know, if you're not related to the person who's being coded. So it was thought that he really got into the code.
Without the initial suspicions of the nurses, without the technology to precisely identify lidocaine weeks or months after death, Leroy Hargrave might have gone free. John Trestrail.
How many bodies do you dig up to find a bullet hole? None. They catch that before they're buried. How many bodies do you dig up to find a poison? Most of them. We're missing them at the point of death, and we're burying the evidence. That's difficult to overcome, but that's what we're going to do.
Among the most difficult poisonings to detect are those involving product tampering. In 1982, 7 people in Chicago died from poison-laced Tylenol. A rash of copycat crimes followed, each with its own bizarre twist. June 11, 1986, the town of Auburn, Washington.
Hey, Mom?
15-year-old Haley Snow finds her mother collapsed in the bathroom. Susan Snow is unconscious. Her pulse is weak. Her breaths come in long, irregular gasps. Haley dials 911. Within 4 hours, this apparently healthy 40-year-old mother of 2 will be declared dead. When paramedics arrive at Seattle's Harborview Medical Center, Susan Snow is comatose. Harborview is the best trauma center in the Northwest, but Snow is fading fast. Snow's condition puzzles the emergency team. Her brain appears swollen, inflamed. She is struggling for breath, and her vital signs are failing. She never recovers consciousness. An hour after admission, she is declared brain dead. What appeared at first as a random death soon will be revealed as murder. It will cost a pharmaceutical company tens of millions of dollars, incite public panic, and set off one of the largest law enforcement operations ever mounted in Washington state. Special Agents Jack Cusack and Mike Byrne were part of the FBI investigation team.
The first victim in this case was Sue Snow. She was a 40-year-old bank teller that lived in Auburn, Washington. And in her daily routine, she always ingested Excedrin.
The cause of Susan Snow's death emerged almost by chance. At her autopsy, the assistant medical examiner noticed the smell of bitter almonds, a telltale sign of cyanide poisoning. Many people cannot detect the odor. By a quirk of genetics, the assistant medical examiner could. Dying by cyanide isn't pleasant. Inside each cell, cyanide displaces oxygen in the energy transport mechanism. Deprived of oxygen, cells collapse. The body dies, slowly asphyxiating, bit by bit. By June 16th, the cyanide source had been identified, the bottle of extra-strength Excedrin capsules in Susan Snow's kitchen. 750,000 bottles of Excedrin were immediately recalled or withdrawn. The news made headlines all over America. Fresh in everyone's minds were the Tylenol poisonings in Chicago. How many would die this time? To catch a poisoner, it helps to get inside his or her head. John Trestrail explains how poisoners target their victims.
One is type S, S meaning specific victim. That victim has a name. They know exactly who it's going to be, whether it's their spouse or whether it's a political figure or somebody. They're going out after an individual with a name. The other type is type R, random victim. In other words, they know they're going to get somebody, they have no idea who it's going to be. And this is where you find your tamperers who are at work either for ego or for industrial blackmail. And sometimes you can actually find individuals cloaked and camouflaged as random poisoners that are specific. So this gets to be a real mind game, the investigation of this kind of an offender.
Susan Snow's death, it would turn out, was a random killing. She was poisoned in a cold-blooded attempt to draw attention away from the real target. On June 5th, 6 days before Susan Snow died, Bruce Nichol had suddenly collapsed at his mobile home in Kent, Washington. When paramedics arrived, they found the 52-year-old Nichol on his back, gasping for breath. His face was cherry red, his body deathly pale. The paramedics had never seen such symptoms before. Nichol's wife, Stella, told them he had been complaining of headaches. Shortly before collapsing, he had taken 2 extra-strength Excedrin capsules. Stella emphasized Excedrin over and over, the paramedics would remember later. She even retrieved the bottle from her kitchen. Evacuated to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Nichol died a few hours later. The autopsy recorded death from natural causes. Nichol had died from emphysema.
Strangely enough, Stella Nichol was also making a few additional calls on her own. She called her doctor, "Are you sure this is what he died of?" She called the paramedics. It could have been anything else. Are you sure that he died of natural causes? She wasn't quite that obvious, but she did make these telephone calls.
Stella called again after news of Susan Snow's poisoning appeared. The lot number of Snow's Excedrin matched the capsules Bruce had taken. Tests quickly proved that Nichol's capsules were laced with cyanide. Nichol's body had been buried, but a vial of his blood remained. It too was tested. Again, cyanide. Across the state, shelves were cleared of Excedrin. But of the thousands of bottles screened, only 5 were found to contain cyanide.
A little quirky thing about that was Stella had 2 of the bottles. And even more strange than that was, she said, hey, I bought one of the bottles about a month before Bruce died. And I bought the second bottle a little more than a week before he died. The odds of that are unbelievable.
Stella's deadly plan began to unfold. First, she poisoned Bruce with cyanide-laced capsules. Then, to make his death appear a random killing, she placed more contaminated capsules on drugstore shelves. Investigators began searching for a motive. They soon found one: insurance fraud.
When Bruce Nichols died, and he was found to have died of natural causes, Stella stood to gain approximately $31,000. If he died accidental death, then this jumped up to about $178,000, and in addition to that, she had a couple $20,000 policies.
To insurance companies, dying by poison counts as accidental death. But had Bruce taken out the policies? Handwriting experts scrutinized his signatures, comparing them to Stella's. The height and width of a letter, its shape and slope, all contain telltale clues. So does the fluidity, the flow and rhythm of the writing, which is very hard to fake. Bruce had not signed the documents. Stella had. Could the investigators now tie Stella to the cyanide? When the capsules were shipped to the FBI's Toxicology laboratory in Washington, D.C., an unexpected clue appeared. The white powder was contaminated with tiny green specks. The specks were 99% sodium chloride, ordinary table salt. Bulking out products with salt is a common manufacturing practice. But what of the remaining 1%? Laboratory analysis revealed 4 separate chemicals. 2 were used almost exclusively in preparations called algicides. One commercial product contained all 4 of the chemicals. It came in the form of tablets, which were bright green.
The laboratory called us back and said, we have positively identified those green crystals as a product known as algae destroyer. It's an algicide used in fish tanks by fish fanciers. And that really rang a bell for us because from the first time any of our agents went in Stella's residence, it was obvious she was a fish fancier. She had fish aquariums all around the front room.
The cyanide had led to algae destroyer. Would algae destroyer now lead to Stella? Agents combed pet stores all over Seattle. Someone might remember Stella and the kind of algicide she preferred. The search ended at a store not far from where Stella lived. It stocked algae destroyer, and the manager recognized a photograph of the woman who frequently bought it there. It was Stella Nichol. For months after Bruce Nichols' murder, Stella avoided taking a polygraph test. Her health would not permit it, she explained. In November 1986, she finally agreed to cooperate. The test is designed to pick up tiny physiological changes. Blood pressure and pulse rate are carefully monitored. Each may change when an individual lies. Forensic detectives use the polygraph to eliminate innocent individuals from their suspect list. That was not to be Stella's fate.
I remember the comment she made when we were walking back to the examination room. And she kind of turned around and said, I feel as though I'm walking into a lion's den. I didn't understand the significance of that comment, but I thought, a little unusual. Stella took the examination. I formulated the questions. They were clear-cut. Did you cause your husband's death? Did you put potassium cyanide in those extra strength Excedrin capsules? Stella clearly showed deception on the test. When we informed her of that in straightforward fashion, she asked for her attorney, who was in the waiting room, and basically, everybody knows how the Miranda rights go. That pretty much terminated that interview that day.
More trouble was in store for Stella. This time it came from an unexpected source, her daughter, Cindy. When she heard Stella had failed the polygraph, she contacted Jack Cusack.
You know, there's no doubt about it. We had a lot of good breaks come our way on this case. And one that paid off initially was the fact that Stella's daughter, Cindy, decided to share with us some of the conversations that she had had with her mother out at the airport.
In 1985, after years of feuding, Stella and Cindy briefly reconciled. They even got jobs together as security guards at Seattle's SeaTac Airport. It was there, in the pauses between flights, that Cindy heard hints of Stella's plan. First, Stella asked her daughter where she might buy heroin. What was a lethal dose? How much cocaine? Then she talked about hiring a hitman to shoot Bruce while she was out of town, or, less plausibly, to kill him in an automobile crash. Finally, she talked about poisoning Bruce.
You know, Cindy told us that, you know, my mother spent a lot of time doing research at the library. She said, my mother would go to the libraries within the Seattle area, within King County, and research various plants.
At first, Stella hoped to identify poisonous plants on her property, which she could surreptitiously feed to Bruce. To check out Cindy's story, the FBI sent teams of agents to every library in South Kent County. It was a monumental task. They were searching for a book, any book, that would tie Stella to poison. Boxes of books were sent back to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. There, a team of examiners scrutinized them for Stella's fingerprints.
We're kind of part of the human behavior aspect of the case, and that's, in a lot of ways, that's pretty interesting. You're in on the interviews, you're kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. A lot of the unsung heroes in this is the poor guy back in the FBI laboratory that gets a half a truckload of books and a set of fingerprints and said, find him in there, and he spends months and months, and all of a sudden calls us up one day and says, hey, in this one book of the multitude of books you sent me, I found 104 of Stella's fingertips in there, and I found 3 palm prints. Well, you can imagine when we're on the receiving end of a telephone call like that.
The circle was closing on Stella. Special Agent Mike Byrne.
So now we have library books that we went out and came up with her latent prints on library books where she actually researched cyanide. We had the insurance where she forged Bruce's signature, and now we had the algae destroy product that she actually purchased.
On May 9th, 1988, Stella Nickell was found guilty of murdering Bruce Nickell and Susan Snow. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
She never buckled. When Jack had a chance to interview her, said you failed the polygraph examination, it was just a stone face. And she never buckled. Even to this day, she's never said anything.
No one saw Stella poison Bruce. She never even met Susan Snow. Still, she refuses to face her guilt. Denial may be a characteristic of poisoners. According to John Trestrail, imagination is another.
We also find that poisoners are very intelligent, certainly more so than the typical brute-like clubbing of an individual as a sophistication of the weapon's delivery. We find they're very artistic. By artistic, I don't mean they paint pretty pictures, but I mean that they can design almost something like a play.
Investigators believe Joe Mealing adopted Stella Nickell's scenario when he read about her story in Reader's Digest. The case begins on February 2nd, 1991, in Tumwater, Washington, 50 miles southwest of Stella Nichols' home. One evening, as the Mealings are preparing for bed, Joe reminds his wife Jennifer to take a Sudafed. Jennifer's snoring disturbs him, he claims. She must be congested. Jennifer does not feel congested, but under Joe's continued pressure, she agrees. A week earlier, Joe had purchased some Sudafed capsules. But why Sudafed, which they have never used, and why capsules? After Stella Nichols, Jennifer is wary of using them. Moments later, Jennifer collapses and rapidly becomes unconscious. Special Agent Tom Turgeson was involved with the FBI investigation.
What happens when someone is poisoned by sodium cyanide was perhaps best described by Joe Mealing himself when he called the 911 operator and described to the operator what was happening to his wife.
My wife is going into some kind of convulsion.
Second Avenue South?
Yes, 1111, 2nd Avenue South, number 2.
Has she ever had a seizure
No, she's never had a problem before. No.
How old is she?
She's 28. She called me from the other room, and her mouth is foaming.
Take a deep breath. You need to be calm for your wife, okay?
Yes, I'm calm.
Okay. Does she use drugs or on any medication of any kind?
She just took a Sudafed.
It was fast, it was swift, and she was in agony.
Rushed to the emergency room, Jennifer is in a coma. The staff struggles to save her life, treating Jennifer for diabetic ketoacidosis, elevated acid and blood sugar levels. In the midst of it all, Joe Mealing makes a curious suggestion to the physician in charge. Have you considered poison, cyanide in particular? Miraculously, Jennifer recovers. She tells the emergency room doctor that she had taken Sudafed at her husband's insistence. The doctor alerts the police and orders a cyanide test. Next day, his suspicions are confirmed. There is cyanide in Jennifer's blood. Without Joe Mealing's comments about cyanide, Jennifer Mealing's poisoning might have been overlooked, just as Bruce Nichols' poisoning initially was missed. But why don't toxicology laboratories routinely screen for cyanide? Washington State toxicologist Dr. Barry Logan.
It's relatively uncommon to uncover an unsuspected poisoning. Usually if an investigation has been done properly by the investigator's office, by the coroner's office, we have information up front about what the circumstances are surrounding the death, so we know whether it's likely to be a poisoning or not.
Dozens of compounds show up on routine drug screening tests. Cyanide does not. And there is a further complication.
Prior tests for cyanide have taken a long time to do, and it's been difficult to generate the results in a way in which the information can be used effectively by the investigators.
Before 1991, detecting cyanide involved a multi-step test which took at least a day to complete. Every sample of tissue or blood had to be tested separately. Dr. Logan has devised a simpler procedure, a litmus test. Chemicals are added to a sample generating hydrogen cyanide gas, if cyanide is present. At the same time, the litmus strip, paper impregnated with a complex of chemicals, is added to the tube. If hydrogen cyanide has been produced, the strip turns purple. The degree of coloration is a rough guide to how much cyanide the sample contains.
The test that we currently use in this lab to screen for the presence of cyanide is very easy to do. We can do a large number of screens in a short period of time, which is a big advantage.
Within days of Jennifer Mealing's near poisoning, Dr. Logan had the opportunity to try out his new tests. On February 11th and February 18th, there were two mysterious deaths. Both fell within Logan's jurisdiction.
We conducted a full drug screen on the sample and found the presence of therapeutic levels of a compound called pseudoephedrine, which is the major component of Sudafed. That in itself wasn't particularly remarkable, but at the pathologist's request, we also did a test for cyanide. The cyanide test came back strongly positive, a level that indicated almost certainly the cause of death as being cyanide poisoning.
On March 1st, a pattern finally emerged. 3 cyanide poisonings, 2 deaths. All 3 victims had taken Sudafed. Next day, Sudafed was withdrawn, and the FBI was called in.
Before we've actually focused on Joe, because that's one of the things we look at are the victim families. But Joe made several comments that he is the primary suspect and that he's too smart to ever be caught, and he certainly wouldn't be caught by the FBI.
But Joe Mealing underestimated the agent's tenacity and the FBI's resources. FBI agents carefully examined the backing of the Sudafed packages in the hopes of finding some evidence of tampering. They found that on untampered packages, the foil breaks when the pill is pushed through the back, leaving a jagged edge. But on the tampered packages, the break in the foil was smooth. Mealing had removed the capsules with a razor, carefully slicing them from the package so he could replace them later.
Throughout the investigation, we tried to learn about nearly every aspect of Joe Mealing's life. We tried to reconstruct everything that he did for a fairly extensive time period, geographically place him into the areas of the crime scenes, to find out what's making him tick, try to find the motive, how does he operate. We want to know everything about Joe Mealing.
Joe and Jennifer married in 1986. From the beginning, they had quarreled, mostly about money. Jennifer took multiple jobs to make ends meet. Joe indulged his hobbies: photography, computer, and theatrical makeup. But in the days before her poisoning, Jennifer later admitted, Joe's normal behavior had changed. 5 days before her collapse, Joe bought the Sudafed capsules, which neither of them had used before. When Jennifer returned home, she found Joe polishing his gram scale. Why now? He had not used it in 18 months. Stranger still, Joe was wearing latex gloves. He never cleaned the kitchen. It wasn't his job. Finally, there was the matter of the insurance policy. Joe caught Jennifer on the way to work one day and asked her to sign what she thought was a small life insurance policy for only $30,000.
He knew exactly what he was doing. He asked her to sign it. When she was in a hurry, on the way out the door, she signs, and now he has a total of $700,000 on her life.
Catching poisoners is rarely quick or easy. Despite the forensic detective's arsenal of sophisticated scientific techniques, often the most important element of a successful investigation is sheer doggedness. The FBI Evidence Response Team begins by meticulously examining a crime scene. Agents don special clothing, not to protect themselves, but to safeguard the evidence. With today's ultra-sensitive techniques, a single drop of blood or saliva, a strand of hair or scraping of skin may seal the conviction of a criminal. Careful record-keeping is vital. Where each item was found, when and by whom must be documented if the evidence is to stand up in court. FBI headquarters in Washington receives so many items of evidence for testing each day, it has been given its own zip code. Fingerprints still remain among the most important clues. The FBI has more than 200 million on file. There are dozens of ways to develop otherwise invisible prints, latent prints. One of the most effective is with the vapor of superglue, which adheres to the print and raises it to the surface. In the Sudafed poisoning case, Agent Turgison and his colleagues fingerprinted every piece of evidence that might implicate Joe Mealing. 6 contaminated bottles were eventually retrieved, but Joe's fingerprints could not be found. Dozens of library books were examined, again without success. Perhaps Joe remembered that fingerprints helped catch Stella Nickel, and so he wore rubber gloves. FBI agents mapped the locations where the tampered packs were found. Joe told the FBI he bought Sudafed from a store near his house. Other tampered packages turned up in a store in the Lacey area near Joe's work. But 4 stores in Tacoma also had tampered product. Special Agent Tom Turgison.
The red dots indicate places where we could place Joe Mealing through physical evidence, through receipts, through witnesses, and other methods. Place him in one store, for instance, and in other areas around the time frame of the tamperings and in the immediate surroundings of those stores.
Joe's link to the 2 stores near his home and work were evident enough. But what of the 4 stores in Tacoma?
We found out that Joe would frequent the stripper bars and talk to the strippers and seemingly just relate his problems to them. We found several of the dancers from topless dance clubs who recognized Joe Mealing, who testified against him at the trial, who placed him up here at certain dates and times. Some of them said he was a regular frequenter of the establishments, and they easily recognized him.
The investigators had tied Joe to the tampered Sudafed packages. Could they now tie him to the cyanide? As the major suspect, the FBI tapped Joe's telephone early on in the investigation. One day, they heard him describe in vivid detail a building he had once visited. From the description, FBI agents identified it as the Emerald City Chemical Company in Kent, Washington. Among other things, Emerald City Chemicals sells cyanide. When investigators examined the poison register for the day Joe had visited the area, they could not find his signature. A Richard P. Johnson had bought cyanide that day. It was all the FBI required. As in the Stella Nickel case, handwriting analysis proved decisive. Despite Joe Mealing's attempt to disguise his handwriting, there are clear similarities between Richard P. Johnson's signature and Joe's own. Consider the formation of the J, for example, the shape of the O, and the way the letters sit upon the line. The person who signed the poison register was Joe.
It was determined that Joe Mealing purchased 1 pound of sodium cyanide on January 11th. A pound similar to this container, which is a representative container of sodium cyanide in the amount of 1 pound. That's a lot of poison, considering a pill the size of a Sudafed capsule killed 2 people and injured 1 other.
One last point puzzled the investigators. When the clerk at the chemical store was shown a photograph of Joe Mealing, he failed to recognize him.
In the residence of Joe Mealing, we found this array of theatrical makeup equipment. Experts in theatrical makeup testified at his trial and determined on the witness stand that there is the equipment here available to make someone up to be unrecognizable as to their true identity. We found a photograph of a person who looks elderly, graying hair, wrinkled face, and it's a friend of Joe Mealing in his late 20s, early 30s.
It had taken 18 months of exhaustive investigation, but by August 1992, the FBI case against Joe Mealing was complete. Shortly before Jennifer's poisoning, he prepared 6 packages of Sudafed. In each, he replaced the Sudafed with capsules filled with lethal doses of cyanide. 5 packets he returned to drugstore shelves. one remained at home, to kill Jennifer. Joe Mealing was indicted on 2 counts of murder and the attempted murder of Jennifer Mealing. He is now serving life imprisonment. Among evidence discovered at Joe's home, agents found one last item of note, an outline for a screenplay about the poisoning of Jennifer. The protagonist, James Martin, is described as devoted, honest, reliable, sincere, truthful.
Joe Mealing was greedy. He was very selfish. I don't think he was concerned about the health and welfare of his wife, Jennifer. He's concerned about Joe.
Just as Stella Nichol learned from the Tylenol poisonings and Joe Mealing learned from Stella Nichol's mistakes, so too investigators learn to prevent and detect such murders. Dr. Barry Logan.
There's no way to prevent a product from being tampered with. What we can do is package it in such a way that if anything is done to interfere with the material, that it's evident to the person when they buy it from the supermarket or before they use the product.
What's important for the conviction of a poisoner are 4 things I call the conviction pyramid. Number 1, we have to have the victim. Then number 2, we have to have the poisoner. And then we have to have the poison and the intent. And all these things have to be linked together. Poison to victim, poison to offender, offender to victim, and then finally the intent. Was the intent really to kill that victim? Once you get those 4 things locked on, then you have the potential for a conviction.
Each year, forensic science provides investigators with powerful new tools. How many poisoners still elude detection? We don't know, perhaps more than we would like to admit. Who is winning the battle? In the end, no one. The fight goes on.